afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us for today's program from Union Public Library. You're going to hear a great story this evening. But before we do, I just want to say a couple of things. There are 3 ways to find out about what's happening at Union Public Library. Actually 4. You can come to the library. You can sign up for our newsletter through our website. You can go to our website and, of course, like us on Facebook. So I want to thank you all for coming, and we'll proceed right ahead. Gordon, I want to thank most of all, who's been very patient with me and with the library in terms of scheduling tonight's program. He is an independent historian, an author and speaker who focuses on New Jersey history. In 2008, he established www.gardenstatelegacy.com, a website featuring resources for the New Jersey historic community. And there is so much on there. I've been on there quite a bit. It's really interesting. He lives in Newark's historic Forest Hill neighborhood with his wife, who's an architectural conservationist, and wrote a book. He wrote a book, and their car, Emmett. He published in 2017, Man Failure, the story of New Jersey Railroad's express passenger train, The Broker, in Woodbridge, New Jersey. His presentation this evening is based on his extensive research, and I'm so happy he's here with us today. Gordon?
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us tonight. Thank you for setting all this up. I know there was some issues with scheduling and with COVID and everything else, so I really do appreciate the opportunity to come speak for you. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully I get this right. All right, everybody seeing my title slide, hopefully? Nod, yes, okay. I wrote a book about this event. This is about the wreck of the Broker. And my slide is not advancing, so there we go. So I wrote a book about this topic. It's called Man Failure, the story of New Jersey's deadliest train wreck, and this was published in 2017. Now, I should point out that there's going to be a second edition that's going to be published hopefully by the end of this month, where I'm going to include a bunch of stories, including never before published material that people have given to me since this book was published back in 2017. So I have the happy problem of having sold out the first 2 printings of it. And so we're going to have we're going to have a new edition coming out at the end of the month. Now, in the process of writing this book, I had the pleasure and indeed the privilege, I would say, of interviewing a wide number of people who experienced this event from different perspectives. And this is just some of them. You see there's people that survived the wreck, that were bystanders who witnessed it, who had family members that were injured or even killed.
Okay, I got it. Thank you. Yep, thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, somebody needs to mute themselves there. People who were involved with the rescue and so forth. And these are some pictures of some of the people I spoke with and a list of the people that I spoke with. And as you can see, it's quite an extensive list. And, you know, one of the things that really kind of fascinated me when I would speak to these people, as much as I was there to talk to them and to hear their experiences, I had questions for them. They naturally had questions for me as well. And one of them was, why was I interested in this topic? Not how did I become interested in it, but why was I interested in this thing? And they had a point. I mean, it's ancient history to them. Not exactly a happy topic. 85 people were killed, hundreds more were injured, just doing the normal things of coming home from work or from school or shopping or wherever. Some of them were injured in ghastly ways that would affect them for the rest of their lives. You know, why would I be interested in this topic? And the phrase that the quote that kind of kept coming into my head was, history is indeed little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. It was by Edward Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And as I'm talking to these people, I'm asking them these questions about their experiences with a train wreck. suddenly these memories that they had that had lain dormant at that point by some 60 years started to come up again. And as they're talking, as they're describing it, you see the eyes growing distant, you see the voices cracking with emotion, and they realize, in a sense, they answered their own question. They realized that what they experienced, what they went through, was something worthy of recording. And, why was I interested in it? Well, I think aside from the whole idea of the part of us that when we drive by an accident on the parkway, we look, we rubberneck, we know we may see something terrible, but we do it anyway. There's a morbid curiosity. But I think more than that, we're vicariously living through their experiences. If I was there, if I was in this train wreck, and I hope none of us ever have to experience this, but how would I have reacted? Would I have risen to the crisis? Would I have helped other people to get out? Or would I have been one of the people who clawed their way out and pushed other people out of the way, survival instinct kicking in order to get out? The thing is, you never really know. These people knew. These people had been through something historic, something worth sharing. So what happened? We have to go back to February the 6th, the morning of February the 6th, 1951. Now, a train crew showed up for work in Manasquan, or in Long Branch. So the train route that we're talking about here, this is this went from Jersey City down to Long Branch. You can see the path that it took. In the morning, the train crews, they signed on at Long Branch, and because most people were commuting into the city, their morning run was to go from Long Branch up into Jersey City. This was a typical morning. This is a commuter train. They got on their train. They took all their passengers up into Jersey City, and then they had what was effectively a layover. They were waiting until it was time to take these same people back in the evening rush hour. Now, I should explain that there were actually two trains that left that morning. One was known as the broker, the other was known as the banker. And these names reflect the kinds of people who are on these trains. This train, we'll get into how they got there, but they ultimately commuted with, connected with Lower Manhattan. That's the financial district, that's the stock market, that's the banks and so forth. So you did get a lot of bankers, a lot of stockbrokers and so on. You got a cross section of other people as well, but that's where the names of these trains had come from. The engineer of the train, he said he spent the layover at the local YMCA, took a nap, took care of all this paperwork, had lunch, so forth, until it was time to come back. So when they signed on in the morning, this is the sign-on sheet that was at the terminus in Long Branch. And you can see this is where the guy signed on that morning. And you can see some of the people who would be on the ill-fated broker. This is the engineer. This is Joseph Fitzsimmons. Joseph H. Hamilton Fitzsimmons. He was the engineer, or as the Pensy guys refer to themselves, the engineman. And this is a picture of him in better days, posing for a rail fan, posing for this photograph. He had come from England, from Ireland, and as a young boy, his father died on the trip over on the ship, and so he and his siblings were basically orphaned in America. They stayed with various relatives. He got a job with the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was an engine cleaner, and the job is exactly what it sounds like, cleaning the engines. And this was how he learned how these beasts worked, literally inside and out. And eventually he worked his way up. He became what they call a fireman, and then later an engineer in the engineer's seat. Also on this sheet is Albert Matthias Dunn. This is him. He was also from Ireland, as you can probably tell from the nickname of Paddy. He was what they call the fireman. Now, the locomotive that pulled the broker that night was a steam locomotive, a K4S steam locomotive. What that meant was you needed a fireman. The fireman's job was to keep the fire going in the steam locomotive. They burned coal to generate heat, to heat the water, to create the steam, which drove the engine. And that was Dunn's job. So it was Joseph Fitzsimmons and Albert Dunn. They were in the cab of this train. Also on this list is John Bishop. Now, I explained that there were actually 2 trains heading north that morning. John Bishop was actually on the banker that morning. He would be on the broker coming home, but he was the conductor. And people think that the engineer is in charge of the train. It's actually the conductor. They're the ones who are responsible for the whether it's the freight that's on it or the passengers that are on it. And he tells the engineer when it's safe to move, where they're supposed to go, and keep time, and so forth. This was the only picture I was able to find of him. He was known as Honest John Bishop for an event that this picture relates to. This is in 1946. He found a case that someone had left behind at the train station in New York, containing over $25,000 worth of jewels. And he was honest. He turned it back in. He turned it in. He got a reward for it. The railroad, they honored him for his honesty. They gave him a reward for his service. And this was a picture of him getting a kiss from his wife. Now, the other gentlemen, they were both born in Ireland. They were immigrants to the United States. Bishop, he was born in Pennsylvania. And again, they all came up through the ranks, working various jobs of the railroad until they ended up on this particular train. Some of the other crew, I'm just going to go through quickly. There's Edwin Craig. He was considered a brakeman. There was also Richard Benton, William Jones, Vincent Laurie. Conductor, brakeman, that's basically, those are leftover terms from the old days. And but basically they were all conductors. So these were the guys that were walking back and forth and collecting the fares from now. We're going to talk more about Fitzsimmons and Dunn in particular, and Bishop, but all of these people would have been in the wreck, and all of them received some form of injury or other as a result of what happened. So this is where they were heading. This is Exchange Place. This is in Jersey City. These beautiful sheds. This building is no longer there. It was torn down. It's the Exchange Place stop of the path these days. If you've been in that area, that was where this used to be. And the reason why they were going here was really because of what was on the other side. These are the ferry slips on the opposite side of the train sheds. And passengers, they would get off they would get off the trains, they would get onto the ferries, they would go across into Lower Manhattan. And as I explained, you had a lot of people who were involved in the financial industry, and that's where those trains got their names from. As I said, Fitzsimmons, he spent his layover until it was time to take everybody home again, just doing paperwork, had lunch, took a shower, and so forth. And then they got their train, and basically they took the banker and the broker, these 2 trains, put them together into one train that was known as the broker. And that was the one that they were going to take back to Long Branch that night, serving all these communities along the Jersey Shore. So in the evening, they were just reversing their trip. But of course, on February the 6th, 1951, they wouldn't make it because of what happened in a place called Woodbridge, New Jersey. So what happened? Let's take a closer look at the landscape where this wreck took place. Now, if you're familiar at all with Woodbridge, you'll recognize this. We'll put some landmarks in here. So for those of you who are not necessarily familiar, there's Main Street, there's Amboy Avenue, 35, the town hall. There's a train station to the north, but we're going to focus on this part down here. Now, as you can see today, there is the New Jersey Turnpike. Back in 1951, they were in the process of building the turnpike through Woodbridge. Now, the train tracks that go through Woodbridge are on an embankment of about 30 to 40 feet. And this came about as a result of several spectacular grade crossing accidents around the Green Street crossing where people were killed. And it was decided to literally raise the tracks up so that they could do away with these grade crossings and just have overpasses. They even raised the Woodbridge train station to where it is today. So in order to build the turnpike, they have to go through this embankment. And well, as you can see, the problem is that this embankment is interfering with the train tracks, it's holding up the train tracks. This is a busy line. Not only was this a commuter line, but you also had freight going on. So you had freight services up and down here. You couldn't just take this out of commission while they built a bridge that would cross over the turnpike. The solution was what they called a runaround or a shoe fly. A temporary track was built parallel to the main line, and the trains could bypass, could go around the construction site while they were in the process of building the bridge that would carry the main line over this new highway. So this change in the normal running for trains that were going through that area, this had to be communicated to the train crews, to people like Joseph Fitzsimmons, Dunn, Bishop. And this was done through what was called a general order. There's different types of reasons why you would have different circumstances where you would have changes in speed, changes in configuration, and so forth. It might be an emergency, but it also might be something that is planned for. This was obviously something that was planned for. They were talking about doing this since 1948, 1949. So they knew that this was coming eventually. This is a page of general orders that was issued. This was issued on January the 29th, 1951. Again, they do this in advance. When the train crews signed on, I showed you the sign-in sheet. When they would sign on, it was their responsibility to look for these general orders, to find the ones that applied to their particular line, to familiarize themselves with it, to memorize it, so that when the time came, they would know what to do. And these would be posted in advance of these changes. Now, this is the one in particular that applied to the broker. Effective at 1 minute after 1 in the afternoon on Tuesday, February the 6th, 1951. And it says, number 2 main track and catenary move 50 feet northward between a point 1,000 feet west of Woodbridge Station and a point 4,000 feet west of Woodbridge Station. I should point out that when they talk about east and west, even though the tracks are going north and south, anything going towards New York is considered heading east, regardless of the compass direction. Anything heading out of New York is considered going west. The point you need to remember here, the takeaway is trains and engines must not exceed a speed of 25 miles per hour between these points. Now, what were they supposed to do with these things? They find their orders. All train crew carried with them a timetable, and this is an example of one. Now, these materials I'm showing you pictures of, these were all exhibits in the subsequent investigations into this wreck by the ICC, the PUC. These ended up in being deposited in the New Jersey State Archives in Trenton. And I went down there for a couple times a week for about a year to review all of this material. And among the items, the exhibits that were in these boxes was this particular timetable. I don't know if anybody actually carried this on the trainer or if this was just an example, but this is the type of book that Fitzsimmons and Bishop would have been carrying with them at the time. So when they're signing on, they see their orders, they find the one that is germane to their run. They're supposed to cut it out and paste it into the back of the timetable. The sheets of paper had a gummed backing. So you wet the back and you can stick it into the back of your timetable. There's a bunch of blank pages just for that purpose. This particular example had the orders inserted and pasted into it. And you can see this is what they would have carried. So on February the 6th, 1951, as the order stated, at 1 minute after 1, the southbound temporary track was opened. It was just a southbound track. I'm calling it southbound track. This would actually be the westbound track. But it was only that track that was open that day. The one heading in the other direction was not open yet. It was just this particular one. Now, you'll notice that there is the red circle there shows you how the track is going from the main line off onto this temporary track that's going to carry them around the construction site. You'll also notice that there is a street there that it crosses that's called Legion Place. That's going to be important in the story. We'll get back to this in a moment. So the tracks are opened at 1 minute after 1, and 8 other trains, 8 other units went through this temporary track without any incident. You can see this is a list of the ones who made it. You can see there's the K4S, GG1. Anybody who knows about the old electric, the GG1s. So you can see there's a bunch of different trains pulling a bunch of different cars, and both the freight and passenger, and they made it through fine until you get to train 733. That was the broker. So at approximately 5:43, the broker is passing through Woodbridge. It did not stop at Woodbridge. This was an express train, so it's just coming down, going full speed. It's coming up to this point where that general order was supposed to take effect. It was supposed to go at 25 miles per hour. It entered that curve off the main line onto the temporary track. Now you can see there where it's crossing Legion Place. Legion Place was an existing road that cut through the embankment. In order to have the temporary track, they had to build a temporary train trestle made out of wood next to the normal bridge. The configuration there is very tight. It's very hard to set this up. So they had to have the shoe fly begin north of Legion Place. The train, if you remember, the orders were supposed to be, the train was supposed to enter through this curve onto this temporary track at 25 miles per hour. It hit that curve at approximately somewhere between 50 and 60 miles per hour, the normal track speed. As it was passing over that temporary wood trestle, the locomotive, the K4S steam locomotive, that made it across. What derailed apparently was the tender that was behind it. Now remember, this is a steam locomotive. You have a tender car behind it that hauls the coal that's going to be burned. It also holds the water, because you're turning water into steam, so you have to have bring extra water with you as well. It's kind of like in your car if your fuel tank was in a trailer behind you. That's what this was. And this tender is the thing that derailed. And when it derailed, it pulled the steam locomotive over onto its side. So the steam locomotive made it across Legion Place, but it was tipped over onto its right side. The tender kept going, and it pulled down the string of 11 passenger cars that was behind it down that embankment onto Fulton Street that you can see runs parallel to those train tracks. Now, I can talk about this and describe it all I want. Pictures is worth 1,000 words. This is an aerial view of the result of this accident. And the map on the right shows you where we are looking. So there's Fulton Street, there's Legion Place. That's that road that cuts through. You can see where the temporary trestle was. So this is the tender. The tender is actually on its top. The chassis was broken in half. It is resting on that retaining wall there. And what's interesting is if you go there now and you know where to look, you can still see the damage from where this car hit, because they went back and put a slurry coat of concrete to repair it. The aggregate, the coarseness of the aggregate is different. You can see where that car landed. Now, in this particular picture, the engine had already been removed, but it would have been roughly here that there's a wrecker crane that's going to be pulling the cars up. So roughly in that area is where the locomotive ended up. But you can see the cars behind them. You can see how they telescoped into each other, crashed into each other, crashed into the abutments. This is looking at it from the opposite direction. So there's your main line. There's the northbound temporary track, which was closed that day. There's a work train on it now for the cleanup. Southbound track, or the westbound track, that was the one that was open. That was the temporary track. You can see the temporary trestles, Legion Place, and so on. And you can see how these cars just banged into each other, slid along each other, opening them up like the proverbial tin can. This is a scene of the rescue operations afterwards. As you can imagine, the emergency services were coming from all over the place. But you can see this is that embankment. This is that 30, 40-foot embankment that carried the tracks above the grade level, above the street level. And now, in order to effect the rescue, people had to now deal with this incline. And you can see all the ladders and so forth. You can see the ladder here. This is from the fire truck. There's a funny story about that. Back, I think it was in 1947 or 48, the Woodbridge Township wanted to buy a new fire truck, and they were wondering, why do they need a ladder that's that long? Because there were no buildings in the town at the time that were that tall. It paid for itself that night. But you can see all the ladders and so forth as people are trying to reach these cars that are all toppled over onto their sides. Now, I'm going to point this out here. And the gentleman by the name of Frank LaPenta, I think he might be one of the people watching tonight. He was one of the first people that was on the scene. And we're going to come back to him later in this talk. But he told me about this. When he first arrived, it seemed like maybe there wasn't anybody on the train. It was kind of quiet. It was eerily quiet and so forth, except the escaping steam and so forth. And then you start hearing the people moaning and groaning and starting to call for help and starting to crawl out of it. He noticed a body that was on the wall. Someone had been thrown from the train. A man had been thrown from the train. And he, for some reason, when you're faced with something that's that god awful, your brain is trying to make sense of it. It's trying to figure out what it is. What am I seeing here? Am I really seeing this? And for some reason, Frank says he focused on the light glistening off the man's shiny patent leather shoes. And it's one of those things that years later you kind of question, did I really see that? And then he saw this particular photograph. And he's like, my God, that's the guy. That's the man that I saw. And you can see the feet are up, kind of facing to the upper left corner of this box. Someone has thrown a coat over the top of his torso. But you can see those shiny patent shoes in this picture. I always say, if it's possible to have a favorite picture of a train wreck, this is mine. Because if you focus on any one corner of this image, it's like a little vignette that tells a story. These appear to be medics from Camp Kilmer. You can tell by the insignias on their lapels and shoulders. When the call went out, I mean, once the first responders realized the sheer scale of this disaster, the call went out all over. And there were nurses and doctors who came from Camp Gilmer. They also sent blankets and stretchers and so forth. And this would appear to be two of the people who responded. This gentleman is being brought down that ladder. You can see there's the Woodbridge Township Rescue Squad, First Aid Squad. There were units from all over the area, as well as I think some even came from Manhattan in order to effect the rescue, as well as just bystanders. Clergy came. Looks like these are, you can tell by the collars, these are clergymen from the area. They came to, in many cases, issue last rites. There are stories about, there's a convent, Mount Carmel in Woodbridge, and there's stories of the nuns who were also trained as nurses showing up in their habits, hiking the skirts up and climbing up through the mud and everything to get into the cars to be able to aid the afflicted. So police were there, rescue squad was there, and of course the fire department was there. And I don't know who this guy is, but the exhausted, kind of overwhelmed look on his face, I think, speaks volumes. Now, I'm going to read something. This is from my book. This is not Joe Leahy, but Joe Leahy was a volunteer fireman in Woodbridge at the time. He was one of the people who responded. And I spoke to Joe for the book, and he was interviewed for it. And he gave this account. I climbed to the top of one of the cars that was over on its side. And you had to walk between the windows because it was on its side. And there was a woman. She got up and she was standing on top of the passenger car. And I'll never forget it. She had the New York Journal newspaper under one arm and a Cushman's cake. Cushman was a big bakery in New York's Penn Station under the other arm. And I took the cake and the paper and I threw them away, and she yelled at me. She was angry that this cake, you don't mess with somebody's cake. Then he goes on and he says, there was a guy in there that was trapped and I couldn't do nothing for him. I ended up doing a crazy thing. Just up the street was a tavern. And I went up to the tavern and I bought a pint of Seagram 7. And I went back up into the cars and I gave some of these guys in the cars a drink of whiskey. Mercy came in many forms that night. Obviously, not only were there the first responders, but there were, you see many people in this picture in civilian clothes who just volunteered, who realized that they needed help. The train wreck fell onto Fulton Street, which ran parallel. And there, Fulton Street, there's a bunch of houses. It's a working class neighborhood. You can imagine these people there. This is the evening, they're getting ready for dinner, and all of a sudden a train wreck is literally dumped on their front yard. And there are so many stories about people opening their homes and giving shelter to the afflicted. Remember, this is before cell phones. You didn't have a phone on you. You want to let your loved one know that you were okay. So they would let people use their telephone. They would, make stacks of sandwiches and brew gallons of coffee to keep the rescuers going throughout the long and grim night. One of the stories that came out of this is the story of the Barshani family. Now, I should point out that I later learned from a relative that they got the name spelled wrong. It's not with a B as in boy, but a V as in Victor. So it's actually Varshani. So they're talking to Mrs. Varshani here, and she's pictured here in the middle. And she describes how they brought in an old man into her home. He was hurt real bad. He kept telling me that he was all right, that I should take care of the others first. Then he asked me to telephone his wife, and I did. He told me to tell her that he had just hurt his foot. But he was brave, this old man, because he was hurt all over. His head was bleeding and his arms and legs were hurt. A lot of stories like that about people, saying, "Oh, don't worry about me. Go help somebody else." A very certain selflessness that comes across. The reporter that talked to her also talked to her brother-in-law. Her brother-in-law was Lou Varshani, and he was described as, quote, this soldier who had gone through the hellfire of Normandy, who had watched amputations in the field, and he was white and shaking. I thought the war was bad, he told his sister-in-law, but this is the worst of all. Remember, this is only 5 years after the Second World War. A lot of the people who were there that night were veterans, including members of the rescue squad, the fire department, police department. They were kind of used to seeing gruesome sights, but you expect that in a war zone. You don't expect that at home. You don't expect that with people just trying to get home from work, trying to get home from school, from shopping, whatever. And they knew what to do. They knew how to handle themselves, but even these guys were shaken. Varshani's husband, John, he had come home from work to find his living room turned into a field hospital, the kind of place he had known all too well as a medic during the war. He walked upstairs, kissed his daughters, placed wads of cotton in their ears so they could sleep despite the roar of the power generators outside their windows and the cries of the injured and the dying downstairs. He walked out the front door, climbed the muddy embankment up into the crumpled coaches, and joined in the rescue. So this is a photograph of Mrs. Varshani. Her name is Barbara Varshani, with their two daughters. And this is in the New York World Telegram and Sun newspaper. And this picture always kind of struck me because it looks like she looks dazed. She's almost like smiling just out of instinct at this point that, she's having her picture taken. But as I said, there were a lot of stories like that about people still remember how the residents of Fulton Street, they rose to the occasion, definitely. So earlier I had mentioned Frank LaPenta, and Frank was involved, Frank and his wife Audrey were involved in creating the monument that is there and memorializing this wreck. And he's part of the reason why I wrote this book. I was introduced to the subject by working with Frank on those projects. So obviously, of course, I spoke to him, and he was a young man. He was about 19 years old at the time. And so this was his story. I had just arrived home from work. I was parking my car in front of my mother's house on School Street in Woodbridge when I heard footsteps running up the street and someone was calling my name. It was Danny Latanzio, a neighbor and a good friend of mine. And I hadn't even shut the car off yet. And he says, "Oh, a train just went off the track down by my uncle's factory on Fulton Street." He had a little factory down there. So they get in the car and they drive over to see what's going on. And at first, it doesn't seem like it's much of anything. A lot of the people who were in the cars at the back end, they got bounced around, but they were able to get off the train and go find alternate transportation, telephones, and so forth. And so you just see people walking with briefcases and whatnot. It didn't seem all that bad. And then they turned that corner onto Fulton Street. And Frank says, what we saw, we'd never expected to see. The magnitude of it was overwhelming. They arrived around the time, just before that fire truck with the aerial ladder had arrived. And so he's looking at the cars, he's looking, and people are just beginning to start to stir. At first, he says he thought the train might even have been empty. Then about that time, I turn back, and here comes this woman towards me with a man, all covered in blood. They're reaching out like you might see in a horror show. They were looking for help. Well, I was only a 19-year-old kid. What could I do? Well, he pushed them over, directed them over towards that fire truck that was just arriving so that they could get help. And he did give someone, a woman, a ride home later that night. Again, this is before cell phones and everything, and she was distraught that her husband might think that she was dead. And so he helped her to get home. Another gentleman I had the privilege of speaking to is Joe Nagy. And Joe Nagy, he was meeting some friends at a local bar. They were going to go to a basketball game that night. And they were trying to formalizing their plans and who was going to drive and so forth. He was only in there for maybe about a half an hour when he says, all of a sudden, the door bursts open and people are running in and they're all bloody and looking for a telephone. We say, what's the matter? What's the matter? The guy says a train went off the tracks. So we grabbed our coats and headed down to see what was going on. And again, like Frank, when they at first it didn't seem like all that bad until they turned that street onto Fulton, or turned from Main Street onto Fulton Street. Was, oh my God Almighty! Now, once he was there, he wanted to help with the rescue. He'd been involved with the first aid squad, and he spotted a guy that he knew, a friend of his by the name of John Fennick from Seawarren. And Joe says that Fennick, he had been on bombers during the Second World War in Europe, and so I think he went on to become a mayor of Seawarren. But in any event, my screen is not changing. There we go. At some point, somebody took their picture, photographer took their picture, and you can see there's John Fennick on the left, Joe Nagy is on the right, and they're carrying someone down that aerial ladder. And you can see the feet draped over the side there. And you can spot Joe there, that pattern on his sweater. You can pick him out in some of the other pictures as well. So these are some pictures. I mean, you know, again, I can talk about this all night. Seeing is believing, and this is a picture of one of the rail cars on its side, and you can see how it's like letterbox. People have to crawl in sideways through the vestibule in order to get into the car. And there's one on you can see the windows of the car on the left, the upper left, how it crashed into the car on the right. Now, the third car in this train was known as the death car. This is where the majority of the fatalities would be. And this is because it hit the embankment, the concrete embankment, and the fourth car behind it slid along it and opened it like the proverbial tin can. You know, you talk about fate, talk about luck, whatever you want to call it. Look at those seats in this car. If you were sitting on the right-hand side, you probably were banged up, but you probably survived. But if you were sitting on the left-hand side, probably not. Where you sat that night could have made all the difference. This is that same car. You can see how it's cut open towards the rear there, and where it's smashed into the abutment, and you see the amount of damage. Now, this picture, I ended up using this picture as the cover of my book, because I felt like, you know, of all the pictures, this one, you really can viscerally feel the amount of energy, the amount of damage, the amount of just the magnitude of this wreck, looking at the amount of damage on this car. It's really quite extraordinary. Now, I mentioned that there was those temporary trestles, the wood trestles, and this is a picture of them. Now, initially, after the wreck occurred, there were a lot of people who were thinking, oh, the trestle, this wood trestle must have collapsed. Well, it did. You can see all the infrastructure is there. All the beams are intact. But what's missing is the train track. People are often surprised to hear that the tracks were not permanently affixed to the bridge. What they did was, if you imagine train tracks, you have the two rails, the iron rails. Then you have the ties between them. They also call them sleepers. These today, you see, oftentimes they're made of concrete. Back then, they were all wood. And what they did was they cut notches into the bottom of those ties, 2 notches at each end underneath the rails. If you look at this picture, you can see that there are stout beams, 3 sets of beams that would go under each track that are crossing the gap of Legion Place. Those notches, they call it dapping, those notches keyed over those stout beams, heavy wood beams. Now, a train that is going 25 miles per hour, you're going to have lateral force as it goes through those curves onto the temporary track. That configuration is going to stop the track from moving from side to side. It wasn't designed for a train that was going somewhere between 50 and 60 miles per hour. The entire track structure lifted up off those beams and was swept off. And you can see where those men are standing, you can see the iron, you can see the rails, the metal rails. You don't see any ties. Maybe that's one in the middle of the bridge. All of those were swept away. All of those were lost. Now, the train cars, as you can see, they're kind of dangling over the street. And there are stories that there were people in those cars who were looking out the window. And this was a drizzly night. It had snowed. It was wet. It was rainy. They look out the window. It's dark. They see lights glistening off the wet pavement and think, oh, we're over a river. Maybe I can jump out and land in the water and get away. Well, people were jumping out of the windows, crashing into the pavement and breaking limbs and so forth. This is the one of only, I think maybe two or three color photos of the wreck scene. This was taken by a gentleman, John Zopko. He is still around. He's been taking pictures. He's what they call a rail fan. He's been taking pictures of railroad stuff for decades. And I have his permission to use this. But you can see the Tuscan red of those rail cars. And I love that little green truck on the left there. I think that's adorable. But that's the Legion Place cut. And you can see how the rail car, how the passenger cars hit those abutments, the concrete abutments, and actually broke them. And you see that where the car has come to, the car closest to you has come to rest. You can see how that's broken off. If you go back there now and you know where to look, you can see where that concrete was rebuilt and patched and replaced. You can still see the crack, the line of where that was put in place. Also in hot demand that night were welders, because they needed help in cutting through the mangled metal of the cars in order to get inside, in order to help the injured and also to free up the bodies of the deceased. Now, this is a press picture that I have in my collection, and these are welders trying to free what I presume to be a corpse. You can see the top of the head there. Yeah, I always thought it was kind of funny in a way. Oops. Sorry. I always thought it was kind of funny where you've got the fireman down here with the cigarette dangling out of his lips, and how some overzealous photo editor decided this wasn't a dramatic photo enough. They had to paint in the sparks. But I want you to look at this gentleman right here. This is Ray Rouland. And you can see him in other pictures and even in some of the movies of the scene with that plaid jacket and that hat backwards. He was a welder from Metuchen, who he had been in Europe and France during the Second World War. He had come home and gotten into the welding business. And he was one of the people who arrived there that night to help. And I know that because I had posted this picture on a Facebook group that I have, in support of the book project when I was writing it. And this woman looks at it and she says, "I recognize that guy. That's my father." So this is another picture from the back, same scene. You can see the victim there, unfortunately. There's also, you see a Sayreville Emergency Squad, one of the other emergency squads that showed up. But this is the woman who responded. This is Ray Rouland's daughter, Muriel Rouland Farino. And she knew that he was there, but he never really talked about it very much. And so I was able to bring those photos and to show her the pictures. She gave her scans of them that she was able to share with her family. And we do this kind of work for any number of reasons, but being able to do things like that and help people to connect with their own family's history is really very rewarding. And I was very happy I was able to do that for them. So these are corpses. These are the dead. Obviously the emphasis was on the living. So the people who were deceased were taken out and left on the side, getting them out of the way so that you could concentrate on the people that you could potentially save. There's several pictures like this from different angles. There's this gentleman with the torch and the pipe with his hand in his pocket, rather laconically standing by bodies. You can kind of tell who's who in terms of the women with the skirts and the men with the pants. Various facilities were opened up or pressed into service as temporary morgues. The garage where the first aid squad kept their equipment was turned into a morgue. The Methodist Church was pressed into service as a communication center. The phone company ran extra lines in there, and so that people who were descending on the area wondering where their loved one was, this is where they would go, and they would try to help them find what had happened. Vehicles were pressed into service. People had delivery vans that suddenly became hearses or became rescue, to take people, ambulances to take people to the hospital. Every resource was brought to bear in this emergency. Now, this is a picture at Perth Amboy General Hospital. The majority of the survivors were taken there, but they were also taken to all kinds of other area hospitals. And all points bulletin was put out, and whatever was the closest who could handle the particular case, that's where you ended up. This is a picture that I acquired not all that long ago now, and there was a caption of it, on the back of it. Bruised and hurt herself, Mrs. Jim Tully of Fairhaven, New Jersey, comforts her husband as he lies on a cot set up at Perth Amboy General Hospital to take care of the injured in the train wreck at Woodbridge, February the 6th. More than 500 persons were injured, 74 were dead. Now, two things. One is I showed this at I showed this picture in a presentation I gave a while back, and I hear a voice out of the darkness, "Hey, that's my parents." So I actually got to speak to the son of this couple. So the caption at the time read that there were 74 dead. That number would keep going up in the days and even weeks afterwards. The last victim of this wreck would die until May. The ultimate total was 85 killed. This remains the deadliest train wreck in New Jersey's history, is the deadliest in American history, certainly post-war history. It's the top 4 or 5 in all US history, and the only reason why there is an ambiguity is there were trains that were like swept away by avalanches or fell into rivers, where the exact number is unknown. So this was a huge, huge event. Now, this is the cab of the locomotive. This is where Joseph Fitzsimmons, the engineer, and Albert Dunn, the fireman, were working. And as you can see, it's over on its right-hand side. If you know anything about steam locomotives, you might even recognize some of the valves and the mechanisms that are there, but you can see how torn apart this cab was. The K4S steam locomotive that was involved with this wreck, in a sense, it too is a survivor. This is the locomotive after it has been righted. It was repaired and it was put back into service. It was a short-lived second life because the Pennsy was phasing out steam for favoring diesel and electric. I think by 1953, it disappeared from their locomotive roster. But again, when you look at that cab end, which is at the left side there, you can see the amount of damage that sustained. So what happened to Fitzsimmons? What happened to Dunn? Well, Albert Matthias Dunn, he was the only member of the crew, of the train crew, who was killed. And this is his grave. I'm not sure, I forgot now which cemetery that this is in, but all these guys, they came from the Long Branch area. They lived in that area because that's where they worked, and they could walk to work to pick up their trains down there. And there was his wife, Lillian. I believe he met her. Albert Dunn. He was in the British Army with the Royal Irish Fusiliers during the Second World War, and they saw an awful lot of action. He'd been gassed several times. I'm sorry. So he actually had a piece of shrapnel that was stuck in his knee that was too deep to take out. He was missing part of his thumb. And I believe he met his wife, Lillian. She was one of the nurses who took care of him. This is during the First World War, I should point out. She was one of the nurses that was taking care of him. That was how they met. Unfortunately, he was killed. Joseph Fitzsimmons, he did survive. He had a very bad head injury, so bad that he forgot making an entire statement to the police after the wreck. He also had a broken rib, and he had back issues. But he did survive, and this was the first picture that most people had of Joe Fitzsimmons, and he just looks totally crushed by what has happened. Obviously, after the dust settled, there were investigations, all kinds of investigations. The FBI was there looking for any signs of sabotage. They found none. The Pennsylvania Railroad, they had their own investigators on the ground. The police were there. The prosecutor's office, the local police were there. The Middlesex County prosecutor's office was there, and so on. Ultimately, there would be two main hearings. One was with the Interstate Commerce Commission. Even though this was a train that traveled just within New Jersey, it communicated with New York via the ferries, so it was considered under their purview. So this is a picture of Fitzsimmons in his hospital bed in Perth Amboy with some of the investigators making his statements. And William J. Patterson, he was the Interstate Commerce Commission's head of their investigation. Their investigation was somewhat cursory. They just kind of went through it and said the train was going too fast and kind of left it at that. They didn't really get into why was the train going too fast. Fitzsimmons, he was a skilled engineer. He should have known why, he should have known what he was doing. Why did this happen? They weren't really that interested in it. By contrast, this is John E. Boswell, chairman of the New Jersey Public Utilities Commission, or PUC. The PUC, they did the most extensive investigation into this wreck, getting down to such minutia as the species of pine tree that the wood came from that made the temporary trestle. Now, these were regulatory bodies, so they were looking to see, is there anything we need to do about the rules, about laws, to try and make sure this doesn't happen again. This is Alexander Eber. He was there looking at it from a legal standpoint, from a criminal standpoint. Was there any reason to charge anyone with a crime? Alex Eber, he actually ends up championing Joseph Fitzsimmons because he took a look at why the wreck occurred. He looked into the policies of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he found them wanting in a lot of different ways. And their handling of the situation did not impress him. And so he felt in some ways that Fitzsimmons was just as much of a victim of the Pennsylvania Railroad as any of the people, the passengers that were killed. As I said, the PUC, that was the most extensive investigation. The transcripts of their hearings total 2,662 pages. And I know it's 2,662 pages because I read 2,662 pages. These are part of the collections at the New Jersey State Archives that I had spoken about earlier. I believe this material may have since been moved to a museum in Pennsylvania. I have to confirm that. But this is what I read in order to write my book. I can distill it down into, obviously, so you don't have to read 2,662 pages. Obviously, they could talk to all the people they wanted to. At the end of the day, the one person they really need to hear from was Joseph Fitzsimmons. He was the man who was responsible for operating that train, for knowing when to slow down and so on, what his orders were and so forth. So what did he have to say? So he was interviewed for several times, and it's interesting to compare and contrast how the story kind of shifts a little bit here and there, which I do in the book. But this is from the ICC hearings. He says, I was looking all the way down there for yellow lights. Lights that would indicate exactly where the restriction was, which is customary. Now, when he talks about a restriction, he's talking about the speed restriction, where he needs to be at 25 miles per hour. He says, first, there's one yellow light that would notify you that you were approaching the restricted territory. Then there is another one that tells you you are at the restricted territory. After you pass through it, there is a green light, which tells you you are leaving the restricted territory. Those lights weren't there. That's what I was looking for. So could this all come down to some yellow lights, a yellow signal, a missing signal? What happened? Well, if I told you what happened right now, you would have no reason to buy my book. So I am actually going to leave it right there, and I'm going to leave it hanging. And I just want to remind everyone that I do have a second edition that hopefully will be out by the end of this month. There will be an Appendix C, which is going to contain 20 pages of all new material, including pictures and stories that have never before been published. So if anyone is interested in that, you can go to my website, gardenstatelegacy.com, send me an email, and I'll let you know. I'm also thinking about publishing the Appendix C as its own separate publication. So if you already have the book, but you want the new material, you'll be able to get that as well. So please do get in touch if you're interested. And that is basically it.
So that was really great. And I'm sure everybody learned a lot. I asked everybody to unmute, hoping that there are questions. Before I do, I want to thank the Union Township Historical Society and the Vauxhall Historical Society for sponsoring tonight's presentation. If you would like to speak, unmute yourself and ask a question. Charles asked, are there any ghost stories associated with the wreck?
There are. That's not my particular area, just because I don't particularly believe in ghosts, but I barely believe in the living. But there are stories. I'm sure there are some stories about things like at the rescue squad building where the bodies were used as a temporary morgue and so on. So,
Okay.
Short answer is yes.
Did the victims or their families sue?
Yes, there were. There was actually, so Alexander Eber, he did actually end up bringing 84 counts of manslaughter against the Pennsylvania Railroad. And it was only 84 and not 85 because the 85th victim died after that had already happened. It eventually got consolidated down into one count for various reasons, and eventually it was dismissed. They just didn't do it. individual families, they did sue. There were various out-of-court settlements. I don't know how much money they got. I've heard stories, I've talked to some people where it wasn't a lot of money. I mean, there were stories that people didn't get enough to cover the funeral for their relatives. I don't know how true that is, but so yes, there were lawsuits. Most of the stuff, as I said, was settled out of court or privately, and so there's no real record of it. I don't know what the amounts were.
So were there any, I'm echoing, I apologize. Were there any other big train wrecks in New Jersey?
Yes, I think it was in '54. There was Newark Bay Extension, where the train ended up going into there was a lift bridge, and the bridge was up, and the train went into the water. And there were actually, people get those two confused. The two wrecks confused. There were several wrecks that afflicted the Pennsylvania Railroad around in the 40s and 50s, and this was the most expensive, the most deadly, obviously the biggest one. And you could argue that it was the beginning of the end for the Pennsylvania Railroad. There were a lot of different reasons for that, but certainly something like this didn't help.
So we have Randy. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, there was also a wreck in 1996. It's a caucus.
Right.
That was New Jersey Transit.
Yeah, and there was one in Hoboken where it crashed into the wall. Yeah. I mean, there are other wrecks. I mean, I'm just thinking about at that time, in the 50s, around that time, 40s, 50s, and there was that other. I think it was 1954, but people tend to remember that one because I think there was a baseball player.
Snuffy Sternwhite.
Snuffy Sternwhite. There you go.
The Yankees.
Yeah. See, everybody knows that one, and so those two end up getting confused. I have read that there were people on that wreck who had been on the broker as well, and who survived both. So, I don't know, their luck held out one more time, I guess. But yeah.
So I'm just going to do another commercial for the library, and then we'll get back to your questions, and we'll end shortly. If you live, work, or go to school in Union, you can have a library card, and you should, because there are so many resources you can get online. You can borrow hotspot computers, all kinds of things. So stay in touch with Union Public Library by liking us on Facebook, going to our website, or signing up for our newsletter, which you can do on our website, or just write yes in chat. I also want to thank Gordon for such a great presentation, and the Union Historical Society, Township Historical Society, Vauxhall Historical Society, and all of you for being here. So I'm going to stop the recording, and then we'll get back to your questions.